Sorry, before
Yes.
you start, I wonder whether I could make a correction,
Yes.
something I think I said during the earlier session. It was about HIV look back, and I think I said at the end that it was a failure. I think that is probably too harsh a commentary, and Dr. Patricia Hewitt in particular spent a lot of time and did make a success, at least a partial success of it. Some of the other RTCs were not able to cope as well with the problems. So if that could be put on the record.
Yes, of
Thank
course,
you.
thank you. Now, the questions I'm going to ask come from a range of sources, so they'll dot from topic
Yes.
to topic rather than being either chronological or following an issue-based order. Could we look at NHBT 15117_001, please? And if we go to the second page, this is just to clarify something, Dr. Rejman.
Yes.
I'd asked you about cut-off dates for the scheme for those who were infected by transfusion and tissue.
Yes.
And I think the answer is clear from this document, so it's really just to make the position clear. So this is a submission from Mr. Schofield to the Secretary of State, 20th of February 1992. It goes through a range of issues relating to the shape of the scheme, and we can see it was copied to you. And if we just go to the next page, please, Paul. Paragraph 5 deals with this issue of a cut-off date. It says most HIV infections from blood/tissue will have occurred between 1979 and October 1985 when testing was introduced, but it would be difficult to apply a cut-off date. It is still possible that infection could be transmitted from a donor who was in the window period at the time of testing. Moreover, one of the reported tissue cases was infected in 1986. And then there's a reference to the circumstances of that. Apart from that one tissue case, there have been no reports of infection transmitted since 1985, but we think it would be better to leave the scheme open rather than fix a closing date, which might result in hard cases. However, claims of infection from blood or tissue after 1985 would have to be examined particularly closely in view of the safeguards then in place. So is it right to understand that that's the rationale for the absence of a cut-off date in relation to this scheme?
I think so, and this actually came into play with that transmission of HIV in Liverpool that was part of the documentation.
Yes, and that was, I think, around 1997.
That's right.
There was the documentations in the materials,
right. And
but there was a transmission, and the understanding was that that had probably occurred because of the window period.
Yes, that's correct. And in fact, there was one individual that was infected. There were 3 individuals infected because red cells, platelets and plasma were used in 3 different individuals, and all 3 individuals were covered by the scheme.
Thank you. So the next question goes back to the issue of hepatitis C screening. I think I can ask this without looking at any of the documents. You've said in your witness statement, and indeed in your statement to the Penrose inquiry in response to the warning letter, that if a donor in the UK tested positive, the BTS had an obligation to inform them. That was your perspective. Can you recall this? Was it the case during the trial, or the trials and pilot studies that were undertaken, that the practice was not to inform donors who tested positive?
I don't know.
Okay, fine.
I mean, so I think that would have been presumably up to the RTC directors to make that decision, but it wasn't something that was discussed.
And then on a unrelated topic, if we could go to WITN 4486016. So we looked at this shortly before the break. This is the issue of the GEB files and what happened to them, and it's your minute of the 7th of June 1995. I just wanted to pick up on what you said in the last sentence of the first paragraph. You say there, Mr. Burridge has asked for the individuals responsible to write to him formally confirming this. Now, that would suggest, would this be right, that you must have had a conversation with Mr Burridge about this issue?
Oh, yes, I would have thought so, yes.
Do you have any recollection now any more about the context or who the individuals were that Mr Burridge was going to contact or anything along those lines?
Well, looking through the files, it would appear that he tried... Well, I don't know, because this was the thing. Mr Burridge left the department about this time, and I think there's some reference in one of the papers to that fact that he had left at that stage, and then I think there was confusion between the loss of that file and losses from the HIV haemophilia litigation files.
So you accept you must have had a conversation with him,
Yes.
but you can't add to what's in this minute?
No, sorry.
We can take that down. The next question is about HCV litigation, but more general. What, if any, awareness did you have of the HCV litigation taking place in Scotland at around the time you were dealing with the HCV litigation in England?
I'd have to look in the papers, but I presume that I were... Well, I think what you have to recall is that this HCV litigation was in very early stages, because we were actually, reading from the papers, it appears that we were chasing the solicitors for more information as to, what they were claiming. And I assumed that we were probably busy enough with what we were doing without worrying about what was going on in Scotland.
And do you happen to know, if you don't, please say so, who was performing a similar role to the role you performed in relation to litigation in Scotland?
Well, I presumed the SMO relating to haematology, but I don't know whether it's Aileen Keel still at that time or somebody else.
Well, we'll be able to ask Dr.
Yes.
Keel about that. And then the next question relates to the timing of the decision-making on introduction of hepatitis C screening. So we're looking at that period, 1989 through to 1991. Is it correct to understand that the trials and studies being undertaken with the various HCV tests that we see referred to in the ACVSB minutes would validate the tests for diagnostic as well as screening purposes? So they could be used to diagnose hepatitis C in patients?
That might have been a side issue, but I think the main purpose of the validation was to see the point is you're talking about a low frequency group, i.e. donors, whereas if you're talking about diagnosis, you would probably be talking about a high frequency group. And I think Professor Zuckerman and others pointed out that with the first screening tests, they were good for people where there was a high incidence, where obviously you're going to get a high number of positives, and they were less good where you had a low incidence, such as blood donors.
Was the implementation of the HCV screening and tests which might then have been used to test, for example, people with haemophilia, might have revealed haemophiliacs infected with HCV, was that delayed by the Department of Health so that the extent of such infection would not alert haemophiliacs to an issue with signing a waiver which included hepatitis C?
Well, I assume that a lot of the haemophiliacs may well have been tested for hepatitis C by this time anyway.
The evidence the inquiry has received, I should say, suggests quite possibly not, or if they were tested, they hadn't been informed. But leave that aside.
Yes.
Was there a deliberate decision or a deliberate lack of urgency on the part of the Department of Health because they were conscious of the simultaneous process of the settlement and, to put it bluntly, didn't want haemophiliacs to know that they'd been infected with hepatitis C because that might deter individuals from signing the waiver?
I don't think that would have been a consideration at all, because I think the thing is that by that stage, and if you go back, I refer in my statement to a paper from 1983, that's a long, long time before this, which suggested that the vast majority of haemophiliacs would have been infected with hepatitis C, and that was before hepatitis C had been discovered, but non-A, non-B at that time, and so I can't see how this would have related at all to that.
If we go back then to the conduct of the HIV haemophilia litigation, I think at one point in your evidence you used the phrase of asking experts to tone down parts of their reports. Was that because the Department of Health didn't agree with the experts' opinions, or the opinions were critical of the Department of Health?
Well, I don't know. One would have to look at the individual expert reports because, for example, we talked about Professor Blum's report. Now, if we had another report from somebody where there seemed to be too much defence of a personal nature, then that might be an appropriate thing to tone down, for example. I don't know. I'd have to actually look at the specifics.
Okay. Understood. It may be submitted that the department, in trying to secure experts for the haemophilia litigation, were engaged in a form of expert shopping, trying to find experts who supported the DH stance in the litigation. What, if any, response would you have to that submission if it were made?
Well, I think I explained yesterday that, in essence, the way we selected the expert witnesses were people I knew or people I knew of or people, that I could easily access, and then some of them obviously were from abroad. But in essence, it was a case of, you get an expert witness, and what you're really trying to get from that expert witness is what they can honestly say. Now, obviously, as we alluded to yesterday, if an expert witness comes up and they basically are critical of the department from beginning to end, then I suspect we would not use them as an expert witness when the court case came. And that, I think, presumably would have been the judgment of the QC, Justin Fenwick. But I think those were a relatively small minority. I think the majority of the expert witnesses were trying to give their best evidence as they could see it.
Do you know whether either Dr. Wolford or Dr. Smithers, or both, were asked to provide statements of fact for the purposes of the HIV litigation regarding the steps that were being taken by the department at the relevant time in which they'd have been closely involved?
I was not aware. I don't think I was ever asked to comment.
And just so it's clear, was it part of your role in the litigation to try and get those statements of fact, or was that being dealt with by somebody else?
Sorry? Those evidence of fact?
Yes.
No, it wasn't part of my role, no.
Now, there was a point in your evidence yesterday when I was asking you about the HIV haemophilia litigation and the approach to the discovery exercise, where you talked about looking for and retaining documents that were considered to be helpful or useful. Was it your understanding when you were performing the task of looking at documents, trying to assist in putting together the department's discovery, was it your understanding that the obligation was to provide all documents that were relevant, even if they undermined the department's case?
Well, I think when I'm talking about helpful or useful, I'm basically meaning relevant as opposed to helpful to our case, because at the end of the day, if there were a document that we didn't discover, the chances are that the haemophiliac solicitors would have them anyway, so there's no advantage not to discover them.
You talked about your assumption that haemophiliacs would know about hepatitis C, in part because a number of them may have had jaundice. Do you think you may be conflating hepatitis B there with non-A, non-B hepatitis C, which wouldn't necessarily cause jaundice?
No, I think the thing is, when you look at that report that I included, the 1983 report, I would say the way that they assessed who had non-A, non-B was on the basis of most of them on the basis of jaundice, some on the basis of raised liver function tests.
Would you accept that the mere fact that an individual had had jaundice, whether it's due to hepatitis B or non-A, non-B hepatitis, wouldn't for one moment connote a knowledge of the severity of hepatitis C or the potential severity?
It would not give them any idea of the severity, no.
Again, when we were talking about the process of your involvement in the HIV haemophilia litigation, you referred, I think, to a couple of occasions, or you referred on 2 occasions to when you took files or documents home.
Yes.
I think one of those occasions you described was when you were looking at the individual statements of claim and producing your notes that would be in the card box database, whatever it was. Is it possible that you may have taken any of the GEB files home?
No, I mean, say, in fact, I didn't take any files home. What I took was individual statements of claim, i.e. the papers. I would take those home and then obviously return them because obviously they were not mine to deal with.
And then can we look again at a document that we looked at, we've looked at already. It's DHSC 0046962061. This was your minute of the 12th of November 1990. If we can go to the second page and just look at paragraph 10 again. This is where you suggested that the suggestion from the plaintiff's representative should be resisted fully, and you talk about how this might lead to absurd demands for all sorts of fancy drugs to be used, as well as, for instance, giving high purity factor 8 at whatever cost to these haemophiliacs. 2 questions I'm asked to ask you arising out of that. Were you suggesting that wanting high purity factor 8 was wanting a sort of fancy drug?
Well, I can't recall this, but I presume this was a time when you had intermediate and high purity factor 8 in circulation. And I think I referred in one of the papers, there's a reference, I can't remember whether it was it a CBLA accountability review or something like that. There's a reference there about high purity factor 8, and it was stated there that I was quoting probably from what the UKHCDO people had said, was that at that stage there was no evidence, no scientific evidence that there was any particular benefit from high purity factor 8. So I think this comment, and I'd actually obviously have to see exactly what was said in the compromise, but I basically, I think was saying there that we have to be wary about any commitment to any open-ended commitment. And I think that was what I'm pointing out here. It's a case that the department would probably be quite happy to have a sort of a general commitment, but not something that was open-ended and could be used, for other purposes.
And then if we just look at the phrase "to these haemophiliacs," that particular phrase in the penultimate sentence, so giving high purity factor 8 at whatever cost to these haemophiliacs, does the wording "to these haemophiliacs" suggest that you thought it was right to make a differentiation between treatment for the infected and treatment for those who were uninfected?
Well, the way the compromise was phrased, it obviously was referring to people within the litigation. So I think what I'm saying there is that we cannot commit to them, and obviously any changes in DH's stance about use of more expensive drugs obviously would not only relate to these haemophiliacs, but to all of them. And I think there that I'm saying that we can't just say, well, these people can have this wonderful treatment, because that's what the compromise said. The compromise referred to these haemophiliacs.
Final question, or a couple of questions. To what extent did you regard it as the role of the civil servant, whether medical officer or someone who was within the administrative branch, to protect the department or protect ministers from criticism?
I don't think it was a role of... Well, see, it depends exactly what you mean by criticism of minister, because I think we tried to do was we tried to present advice to ministers which we thought genuinely was appropriate in the given circumstances. And to say protecting ministers, I think you might refer to sort of protecting ministers. Well, it's difficult to understand, because I think, you know, what are you protecting them from? And I think the thing really is probably from unfair criticism as much as anything else. If one could see that, for example, I don't know, I mean, say, the information division was forever sort of having to tackle comments in the press. And if we felt that the comment in the press was inaccurate, then we would obviously, ID would ask us, you know, for a comment, you know, is this correct? And if we said, no, we don't believe this is correct, then obviously ID would then contact the particular newspaper and say, look, you need to amend how you've actually put this. So I'm not sure whether we actually were protecting ministers as such. I think it was a case of trying to do our best to give the information that we had at our disposal to ministers, and so that the information was there, and so that if any information which was counter to that, then we might be trying to make sure that the correct information was out there.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask from the suggestions from core participants. I'm just going to turn and see whether Ms Gray... No, Ms Gray has no questions. Do you have any, sir?
No, I don't.
Dr Rejman, is there anything you would wish to add?
Well, it's been a long day, so I'll just give a very brief comment, if I may, and that is that I just wanted to say again that I wish to express my genuine sympathy for those infected and their loved ones. I appreciate that this has been the cause of much distress. I hope that my statements, based mainly on papers from the time rather than my poor memory, has provided some additional information about events in the Department of Health at that time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank you. It's often the case, and you have, I think, demonstrated it yet again, that the picture presented by oral evidence is much more revealing than the printed page. So I'd like to thank you for coming to give evidence and enabling us to see that picture. I have a feeling that I'm much clearer about your views and your approach, which has been really helpful to appreciate. So thank you very much, and thank you for your endurance, in particular today, given the time, and I shan't take up any more of it for that reason.
Thank you very much.
So tomorrow we hear from Dr Pickles.
Yes, so 10 o'clock tomorrow, Dr Pickles.
Thank you.